My name is Julie Bates, and I'm going to be your mistress of ceremonies for the afternoon. I believe this publication is an extraordinary piece of work of sensible public policy, and no doubt it will be controversial, as it shines a very, very harsh light on the harms and what is necessary to protect the human rights and health and well-being of people who use drugs while incarcerated in New South Wales prisons. However, it's a very human face that should touch all those who read it. It's my view that this is definitely the missing link in the Australian harm reduction story. It's my great pleasure and honour to welcome you all here today to the launch of Stories from the Other Side, an exploration of injecting drug use in New South Wales prisons. I'd now like to welcome you to Donna Ingram to present Welcome to Country. Donna is the cultural representative, Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. Donna was born and raised in Sydney, and she's the mother of 4 children. Donna has worked in Aboriginal affairs and community organisations in Sydney for the past 25 years. She's a former ATSIC councillor for the Sydney Regional Council. So I'd like to welcome now to the stage Donna Ingram.
On behalf of Metropolitan Land Council, I'd like to congratulate NUAA, and especially those that have bravely shared their personal stories and experiences for this publication that gives a voice to people in prisons about the need for making sterile injecting equipment available to them. In closing, we always remember that this is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much, Donna. The old Darlinghurst Jail, and what a very appropriate place, I think, to launch such a resource. And if only the ground and the walls could talk, I reckon it would be telling us stories of incredible fear and sacrifice and deprivation, but I also think it would tell stories of amazing pride and honour and resilience, perhaps not so unlike we will see inside the pages of this most wonderful resource. So the next person I'd like to invite up here is Nikki Barth. Nikki is the CEO of NUAA, and she's going to provide us with a genesis of the publication and its development, and she can provide an acknowledgement of the individuals involved. Over to you, Nikki. Welcome.
This is an important publication that has been produced by the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, the statewide drug user organisation, in partnership with people who have recently been incarcerated in New South Wales prisons. We know that this makes this a vulnerable publication open to criticism and disapproval. We appreciate for some that the availability of illicit drugs and needles and syringes in New South Wales prisons is a complex and challenging issue. However, we believe that this publication is not only warranted, but deserves to be examined by all the relevant stakeholders. Viral hepatitis and HIV are major public health issues that need to be prevented in New South Wales prisons as well as in the community.
I think we're very, very honoured that Neal Blewett has generously agreed to officially launch this resource. If anybody looked at the book, a quick glance so far, Neal's forward to the Stories on the Other Side is a testament to his long-term commitment and understanding of what it takes to ensure better health for all. We're also honoured by Neal's stated acknowledgement that it is a brave and challenging publication which deals with what he says, and I agree, the unresolved issue of drug reform from the 1980s. I'd now like to welcome Neal Blewett to the stage to provide the official launch of Stories from the Other Side.
I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and say how privileged I am to be asked to launch this quite beautiful book in terms of production, Stories from the Other Side. It is a courageous book, it is an original book, and it's a challenging book. It's courageous in the sense that it takes up the cause of a very marginalised minority in our community, and that requires courage to argue for the rights, the health rights in this case, of prisoners in our correctional institutions. It is original in that it juxtaposes essays by prominent figures in the drug field with the words of those not usually heard in the debate, that is, drug-dependent people who've been in prison, the voices from the other side. And that is a very original contribution to this whole debate. We need to finish off the agenda of the 1980s and bring into the prisons a needle and syringe program. Again, I quote those drug-dependent people who've been in prison. Marcus, you don't give the prisoners dirty razors to share with each other and go, here you go, here's a rusty razor, go have a shave with it, do you? So what's the difference between that and giving them a clean syringe? And if somebody might say to that, well, if you give them a clean syringe, it's kind of approving drug use. And one of the good Bush lawyers in this book, Ryan, says, sexual congress is frowned on in prisons, but yet the prisons themselves provide condoms. Both are harm minimization techniques. Both providing condoms in prison and providing syringes in prison are to try and reduce the specific harm of drug use. It is not just about the prisoners. It's about the prisoners' wives, their families, their children, the extended community. We can't escape the fact that prisons do incubate blood-borne virus diseases. Very clear, the evidence on that is overwhelming. Now, unless we have programs to deal with that, we spread these diseases out into the community. The blood-borne diseases picked up in prison are then passed on to family, to children, to other contexts. And as Marcus writes, why is it that the prisoner's partner and children should suffer outside if they caught hepatitis or HIV in jail and then brought it out to their partners? So what we're talking about is harm minimization. So how can you then say that a life sentence should be given not just to the prisoner, but to the prisoner's children and family? And finally, and I don't wish to be invidious, but I think the best chapter in the book is that by the German professor on international comparisons. And why I say that is the best chapter in the book is simply that is new evidence we now have which we did not have in the 1980s. One of the great arguments when health ministers agreed to introduce needle and syringe programs into prison, but were foiled by the police and by the police ministers and by the culture of the police and the prison officials. And one of the things they said to us is, look, nobody else does this. You've got no evidence for it. What we have now, and this chapter brings it out very clearly, is some hard evidence. If we want evidence-based policy, it's there. If I might just quote, some of these programs have been in place for up to 10 years and have been extensively researched, and these are the conclusions. I'll just mention the conclusions rather than go through them in detail, but I think it's a pretty overwhelming support for these programs, if I can now find the place. So, first, they do not endanger staff or prisoner safety, and in fact, make prisons safer places to live in and work. They do not increase drug consumption or injecting. They reduce risk behaviours and transmission of blood-borne viruses such as HIV and HCV. Other additional positive outcomes for the health of prisoners, such as referral to other drug and health-related services. They have been effective in a wide range of different prison systems. All of that, you see, is now being researched, that we've got evidence for it, we can present it to the politicians, present it to the policymakers. And there's a last point I would want to make. There are now 8 countries which practice some forms of needle exchange programs in their prison. A number of them are what I would call the usual suspects, countries like Switzerland, Germany, Spain, and Luxembourg. But there's an interesting number of countries there: Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Romania. Now, what have these countries in common? None of them, I've never heard of Tajikistan being held up as a human rights example to the world. None of them, I've never heard Moldova being held up as soft on drugs. What they have in common is that in their populations there are heavy burdens of the blood-borne virus diseases, hepatitis and HIV, and they recognise that for their community's sake, but above all because they're poor countries, for saving on their health bills, the only practical path to go down is this one. And in finishing, I commend the book to you all, but above all, I commend it to the policymakers who make these critical decisions for our country. Thank you.
Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our fantastic panel of experts, Chris Puplick, who is no stranger to the fight against HIV and HIV discrimination. He has a long record of service in public office, including periods as a Senator for New South Wales, President of the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board and New South Wales Privacy Commission. He's held numerous senior positions in both the health and arts sectors and has been actively involved in the development of Australia's responses to HIV and hepatitis C for almost 30 years. Welcome to the podium, Chris Puplick.
I also wanted just to say very briefly that the remarks I'm going to make today I make in an entirely personal capacity. I'm not speaking as the chair of the Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network, and what I'm saying does not represent or purport to represent the policy of either that network or the Government of New South Wales. What has always struck me in relation to Justice Health is what a disgrace it is that for so many people, they in fact will never get better health care and treatment than they do when they are incarcerated. That for many people it will be the first occasion that they have access to dental health, to a sound diet, to a safe place to sleep, to 3 regular meals a day, to an environment in which their health needs can be responded to, in which they get access to psychological and psychiatric services. And it is a condemnation of all of us as a society that for many people that in fact is the best health care that they will get. In terms of the question of needle and syringe programs, I think these are the important points to make. We are aware of what the evidence tells us, and Neal has touched on that already. We are aware of the positive overseas experiences. We appreciate that there is not a universal view in relation to needle and syringe programs, both within the prison population and within the general community. We appreciate that there are legitimate concerns on the part of the staff who work in the organisation to be concerned about their safety, and it's an important responsibility of those who are in possession of the evidence to persuade people that in fact such programs can be introduced without a compromise to their safety. The tragedy is that the one event worldwide which took place, which in fact involved an officer subsequently dying from a needle stick injury deliberately inflicted on them, was in New South Wales. It remains the only known case anywhere, but of course its impact lingers. This is not simply a health matter, it's a matter which involves public policy, it's a matter which involves corrections, it involves drug law enforcement, it involves police, it involves Attorney General. And it may very well be that at the end of the day the political system is not able to deal as effectively with the problem as it can, as it should, and that in fact it will end up being determined through the legal process, through the courts. And in many cases, we in fact have had to resort to the courts, whether it was the right of prisoners to participate in elections, to get the vote, or indeed whether it was the introduction of condoms into the prisons, which was essentially achieved by the process of using the courts of New South Wales. But the value of this book is that it helps us to re-engage in all aspects of that debate. It presents clearly a summary of the evidence, and it adds to that something which has been otherwise missing from the public debate, namely the voices of the people who don't usually get listened to, the marginalised, the unrepresented, the often inarticulate, and above all, the disempowered. This book, as a result, becomes an important resource. It's an important resource which will allow me and others within the system who have a view about the necessity to move in the direction of eventually establishing a comprehensive system of needle and syringe programs within the corrections centres and within the justice system of New South Wales to argue our case more effectively and more forcefully. I certainly give everybody an undertaking that I intend to do that to the best of my ability, and I do want to thank people once again for the contribution that they've made, not only in getting the material together, but in producing such a handsome and elegant book, which itself I think will be an enormous contribution to advancing the public policy debate. And perhaps one day on this issue we can forge the sort of consensus that Neal and I and various others forged 30 years ago and more in dealing with that particular health crisis, because in many respects this is part of the unfinished business that we started back then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, our next speaker, Annie Madden, is a roving harm reduction human rights stalwart, and she lives and breathes a better deal for people who inject drugs. She's the Executive Officer of the Australian Injecting Illicit Drug User League, called AVIL, which is a national peak body for state territory drug user organisations. I'd like to welcome you to the stand, Annie.
It's important to make the point straight off and unambiguously that AVIL believes the ongoing and active refusal of Australian governments, federal and state, to provide access to evidence-based approaches to prevent the documented transmissions of BBVs in Australian prisons is a dereliction of duty, a fundamental human rights violation, and perhaps most significantly of all, it is illegal, both at international law and domestic law. Article 25, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 12 of the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, both of which Australia has been a long-standing signatory to both of these, enshrine at international law Australia's legal obligation to provide the highest attainable standard of health for all, and yes, that does include prisoners. As far back as 1990, and the UN Principles of Treatment of Prisoners in 1993, the World Health Organization Best Practice Guidelines on HIV infection in prisons specifically articulated the principle of equivalency for prisoners, that is the right to healthcare, including prevention, to an equivalent standard as available in the general community, regardless of legal status or nationality and without discrimination. Since 1993, numerous other positive and favourable WHO, UNAIDS, even, dare I say it, UNODC, the veritable cops on the beat when it comes to drug control policy globally, have all made pronouncements on the subject of NSP in prisons. Last year, the UNDP Global Commission on HIV and the Law, whose commissioners include ex-presidents and prime ministers of countries and highly eminent people such as Australia's own ex-High Court Justice, the Honourable Michael Kirby, highlighted the serious potential legal implications of governments ignoring their legal obligations and duty of care to prisoners in relation to HIV transmission and other BBVs, and in short, they are telling you that governments ignore this issue at their peril. The domestic laws of Australia recognise that a person's capacity to access health services should not be compromised by the reason of imprisonment, and that all people have the basic right to health. So while the Australian government does not have direct responsibility for administering prisons or health services within them, they do have direct responsibility, along with the states and territories, to implement the national bloodborne virus strategies, including the National Hepatitis C strategy and National HIV strategy. The Hepatitis C strategy admits people in prisons are at an increased risk of exposure to hepatitis C. They admit that this is because they lock up way too many drug users. They admit that there is the use of non-sterile injecting equipment in prisons, which, by the way, is a euphemism for prisoners that are forced to reuse fits that have almost certainly been used hundreds or if not hundreds of times each. By extension, they admit that illicit drugs are being routinely injected in Australian prisons, that IDU and Aboriginal people are vastly overrepresented in our prisons, and that prisoners are at least 40 times more likely to test hepatitis C antibody positive than the general population. But let me tell you, in the ACT, they have a proposed, albeit flawed, model. They have even a draft framework for an NSP in that prison. They have qualified support from some prison health staff. They pretty much have a war with parts of the Prison Officers Union. They even have a political mandate to see this through, but they still don't have an NSP in the ACT prison. One of the things we often say is that people are in prison as punishment, not for punishment. And currently, that is what happens. People are given their sentence and serve their time, and they usually get a blood-borne virus to go with that. They are punished. We've got a long way to go before we move on from that even very low bar. So congratulations to NUAA. I think this resource will make a difference, and I think we need to just all commit to continuing the fight and not stopping until we actually get the outcome we're after. Thank you.
Okay. Our next speaker, Ingrid van Beek, has devoted her professional and I believe possibly most of her personal life to improving the health and well-being of people at the margins of society. Ingrid also chairs the Hepatitis C Prevention Subcommittee and of the New South Wales Ministry of Health's Advisory Committee on Hepatitis. Welcome to the stand, Ingrid.
I'm speaking here mostly in my capacity as the chair of the Hepatitis C Subcommittee and also, of course, as director of Kirkton Road Centre, not far from here. And been asked to give a bit of a focus as well on the sort of epidemiological evidence around the need for harm reduction strategies in custodial situations. There are very complex reasons as to why people engage in risk behaviour in relation to injecting and hepatitis C. And, you know, it always seems to me fairly obvious that in order to effectively address that risk, you know, we need more than just needle syringes. But goodness knows, the needle syringe program and ready available access to needles is a damn good start. But yeah, from a public health physician perspective, it's populations that are the really sort of key way that we like to look at things. And inevitably, I think that means that we have to kind of move across walls and barriers and actually look at the sort of journey that individuals within those populations travel and make sure that when we're developing public health strategy that we're, you know, with people for that entire journey in those different locations. So people who have managed to actually maintain safe kind of practices in community situations, go into prison, bang, end of story, making it sort of the black hole of the journey. So it is, of course, very relevant for us from a public health point of view to see it as very much part of the sort of continuum of environments that need to be made healthy. People who had been incarcerated were 6 times more likely to have acquired hepatitis C compared to those people who hadn't been incarcerated. We know from our own data and again from the NSP annual survey data that about half of the people who inject drugs that attend needle syringe programs have been incarcerated at some stage, probably up to a quarter in the last year. And interestingly, I guess lack of things to do, I mean, that comes out very strongly in the course of the stories as well. It is not straightforward. It is a very different environment in a prison to out in the community. And even with all of the best will in the world, I think that it's, even if we were so lucky as to be able to get that first step, which if for no other reason, I think is incredibly important symbolically, it seems to me that to actually have effective hepatitis C prevention in that environment, we're going to need more than just that as well. And I guess I'm thinking about things like, you know, better access to drug treatment in prisons. So we are, again, we fare quite well internationally in terms of access to methadone and buprenorphine treatment in custodial situations, but we rarely actually start people up who weren't on those programs beforehand. And at a minimum, we should be saturating the prison with those sorts of options as well. But of course, better still, might be better to actually try to skip the incarceration episode as part of the journey of this highly marginalised group of people altogether. And for that, of course, we need drug law reform, and for that, we need even bigger doses of political courage. And sadly, again, I haven't seen any appetite for that in this country for quite some time. So on that sort of optimistic note, thank you.
Our next speaker is Greg Denham. Greg has been a serving police officer in Victoria, my hometown, and in Queensland, including 5 years with the Victorian Police Drug and Alcohol Policy Coordination Unit from 1997 to 2002. And importantly, Greg formed the Australian branch of LEAP, that's the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, in 2010, which unites thousands of police and criminal justice officials worldwide who want to end the war on drugs and advocate for law reform. Welcome to the podium, Greg.
As far as I'm concerned, the whole issue really isn't that complicated. I guess as an outsider and talking about working with police and working with prison officials, I can talk about, I guess, what the culture's like, what the people are like, and how you might approach prison officers and police working in this area. And so, from my perspective, I guess it's pretty straightforward, but I know for other people working in this area, it is obviously quite complicated. I guess the future, from my perspective, is not looking all that positive, and I think for those working in the harm reduction field, I think we'll be looked upon a bit like Oliver Twist in the future. Please, sir, can I have some more? Such as a lack of policy development in this area. Funding is also going to be an issue. Australian government spending on law enforcement, drug treatment and harm reduction was approximately $1.7 billion in 2009-2010. 2/3 of this was spent on law enforcement. Treatment received about a fifth, prevention 1/10, and the harm reduction only 2%. I think we also, in the future, will more regularly and more forcefully hear the tired old cliches such as harm reduction undermining the anti-drug message and zero tolerance wheeled out when progress is sought to reduce the risks of illicit drug use, particularly injecting drug use. Police and prison officers' views about drugs are shaped by the society they are taken from and are further shaped by the people they see as affected by illicit drugs within the criminal justice system. They see people at their worst when it comes to the impact of drugs, impacting on friends, families, victims and the broader community. Many hold fairly cynical views about the ability of prisoners to change their ways, and correction services are viewed only as a means to keep society safe, knowing that jails are a revolving door with little prospect of rehabilitation in their opinion. While they're extremely risk averse, the evidence just doesn't support their concerns about needle stick injuries or their use as potential weapons. Only one incident that's been spoken of already, and none in jails where NSPs exist. However, as with police, occupational health and safety issues have been one of the major policy drivers over the past 20 years, and prison officers' safety will, and in my opinion, always take precedence over all other concerns, even to the detriment of the health and safety of others. For many prison officers, NSPs in prisons may be perceived as more of a reflection of their failure to create a drug-free environment. Just as supervised injecting facilities may symbolise or label a suburb as a failure in the war on drugs, or a school will refuse to acknowledge that their students are using illicit substances. There are strong ideological differences at play both within and external to the prison environment. Research and scientific evidence just doesn't hold the same weight as the body of tradition, myth and doctrine that holds true for police and prison staff in many situations. So where would I start? Well, if you have no policy agenda, no political support and no prominent champions within the system, then it's going to be tough. In other words, police talking to police or prison officers talking to prison officers, peer education is more effective and likely to work than an outsider who lacks credibility in their eyes and will be treated as suspiciously. I'm not saying that the involvement of another prison officer will instantly break down any barriers. However, it does help to have someone who knows where the other side is coming from. Finally, I wouldn't be totally dismissive of those working in the criminal justice system. I'm frequently reminded that in nearly every group of police and prison staff in prisons, both here and overseas, that I've worked with, there is always a silent few who are prepared to listen and are keen to act if they are given the opportunity. Many have private views which support what you are saying or support what you are advocating for. Publicly, they may not be as open, but privately they'll agree. So we need to find ways to empower those who are our potential supporters. So I hope these words will provide some understanding and guidance. I think the establishment of a needle and syringe program in prisons presents an extremely difficult challenge. So in many ways it is complicated, but congratulations to NUAA, congratulations to all of the staff for the publication of this fantastic resource. Thank you.
Many people came forward to tell their stories and advance policy ideals in the making of this resource, but none requiring the strength of courage as those who came to tell us of their personal experiences of incarceration and injecting drug use in prisons. Fearless folk who risked all. We're very honoured today to have Sonia and Eddie with us, and I'd first of all like to introduce Sonia. Sonia is an Aboriginal woman who was born and raised in Redfern, where she's lived most of her life. She's active in the Redfern community and very passionate about protecting young Aboriginal people from the impact of injecting drug use and bloodborne virus transmission. Sonia's motto is "Sharing isn't caring." I'd like to welcome Sonia to the podium. Thank you, Sonia.
I'd like to tell you a story that a friend of mine told me about 10 guys in jail. I believe she was a wife of one of these men that were in jail. Now, there was 10 men in like a cell, obviously sharing equipment. Now, one of the guys that was with the 10 had been transferred to another jail. And before he was transferred, he had blood tests taken to see if he had any infections of any kind. When he got to the other jail, he had found out that he was HIV positive. So all of these men that were now still in the other jail had no idea that this gentleman has now got HIV, and they had possibly got it as well. Now, this guy has been let out of jail, and the other men as well. Now, they've gone home. Some of them were occasional users. The others, were probably everyday users. But some of them occasional, gone home to their wives and families, and one of these men might have an accident in the house and there's blood on the floor and they have children running around, and then they might become infected if they have a cut or something on their hands. So I really believe that people in jail should have access to clean equipment when they're in there. People should be able to come out as healthy as when they went in, not come out in poorer health. Prevention is better than cure when it comes to educating our young, because when they haven't got clean equipment around, they will ask anybody that's in the group that they're in if they can use or share the equipment that they have got. Now, if there is no clean equipment, they will so easily take somebody else's equipment and use it. And the most common phrase I'm hearing now in our communities is, "Oh, don't worry, I have Hep C," and then the person that wants some equipment off this particular person will say, "It doesn't matter, I have it as well." But they haven't got the education to know about different strains, so the sharing becomes just so easily down there, and it's very scary because of, the sharing that's going on, within our kids, because educating them about these viruses is vital. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the book. I have, and I do. Thank you.
Perhaps we have kept the best for last, but we've certainly kept the bravest of them all for the last. Our last speaker is Eddie, and he's an Indigenous man of Indian descent who was born in Melbourne. He's been an injecting drug user for 20 years and also spent a significant part of his adult life incarcerated. He's a contributor to the book, Stories from the Other Side, and Eddie is a strong advocate of harm minimisation programs, particularly prison-based NSPs and education for inmates. No doubt he's seen it all. Eddie's going to join me up here because he reckons if I can do it, he can do it. Come join me, Eddie.
Governments, politicians and law enforcement agencies around the world call this travesty the war on drugs. If this social problem is an alleged war, then I ask you, where are the battle lines? They are blurred. They're all blurred. Who is the enemy? We can't be sure. What are we fighting for? Is it complete prohibition? We need law reform. Drug court just does not seem to cut it. The stigma attached to the use of illicit substances and the method used to consume them, intravenous ice pipes, etc., has a massive impact on everyday society because the media has taught us to believe so. Upon my release from a maximum security facility in Victoria, I was diagnosed with hepatitis C, genotype 1, and this is commonly known as a jail strain. Admittedly, I had only shed needles twice in that last sentence. Ironically, I'm almost certain which shot may have been responsible for the transmission of the virus. Upon receiving a sentence or upon being on long-term remand until, for example, 2 cases heard and sentence being handed down, or time served and then a suspended sentence being handed down in that case, prisoners, inmates need to discreet and ready access to intravenous equipment to prevent cycles of lock-up, sharing, transmission of bloodborne viruses, which just continues the cycle on and on and on, and then it goes out into the public and into the community. The issue of additional time, like if a prisoner is caught with drug paraphernalia, they are to be punished and given longer sentences to serve extra time. So do we reward such behaviour for the people that dob us in and lag us to the prison officials and guards? And do we reward that behaviour, and give them shorter sentences or give them extra privileges when they dob us in for all we're trying to do is use bleach or Fincol is in a jail or try and use new syringes. Ultimately, we're just trying to protect ourselves and our families from BBVs. Prisoners should have basic human rights that allow us to leave jail without extra BBVs than when we got there. Change is necessary. What we are doing now does not seem to be working. Why not admit that we need a fresh approach that will indeed save lives of not only the innocent families of prisoners, but also the prisoners themselves? How do we quantify this? I mean, what, do you add time to my sentence every time I get caught with a new syringe? Just add time. I mean, or do I add time to my lifespan? What's worth more? To all the policymakers and those involved in law reform, please consider the lives of the families of prisoners, along with the community, and last but not least, the inmates ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. NUAA is incredibly honoured and heartened the number of people attending today and showing such solidarity with the issues and our speakers, and for your overwhelming respect and support for this publication. I hope it travels far and wide, and you lot share it at every opportunity along the way. So we've now got a few people to thank, and thank you all very much. Big round of applause to all of you. Thank you.